previous video, we saw how to derive the major and minor scales. And we saw that, for example, A minor is a scale that has no sharps. It's just A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Well, we know that because the function we would use to generate the major scale is a different filtering function, the A major scale is going to look different than the A minor scale. But here's an interesting question that emerges. Because that filtering function between major and minor is different, would there be any scale where the major scale would end up containing the exact same notes as the A minor scale, even though it's a major scale? AKA, would it be in the same key? And it turns out the answer to this question is yes. And in this case, it's C major. So the C major scale is going to look like C, D, E, F, G, A, B. And we would notice that if these were unordered, aka we were looking at the key, these would be identical. And when this is the case, you can say that A minor is the relative minor of C major. And likewise, C major is the relative major of A minor. Another interesting thing you might find is that the relative minor of a scale is always going to live on the 6. So if we did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, you could look at any major scale, go to the 6, create a minor scale from it, and it will be in exactly the same key, which is going to be extremely important. Likewise, if you looked at a minor scale and you looked at the 3 of the minor scale, the 3 of the minor scale will always be the relative major of the minor. Let's look at another example just to hammer this home. We can look at G major. G major is G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp. And if we looked at the 6, that would be E. So we know that E minor would now be the exact same key, but just starting on E. So E, F sharp. There's G on the 3, which is the relative major. A, B, C, D. Now, before we go all a Russell Crowe in A Beautiful Mind and start drawing these crazy connections between scales, it might be helpful to have some sort of universal classification method where we can classify and quantify each scale so that we have a more structured way to talk about them and their relationships. So it would be nice if there was some way that we could, take each individual major and each individual minor and just classify them together in one format. So this relative major, relative minor seems like a good start. But another interesting thing we might want to look at is the number of sharps that are present in each pair of scales. So for example, C major and A minor have 0 sharps in their scales. And G major and E minor have 1 sharp, F sharp. So that already seems like this might be a promising path to go down. And I'm going to start making a list over on the left side here. So I'm going to say 0 sharps is C major / A minor. And then I'm going to cross them off of our little list here so that we know which scales we've used so far. And we know that there's a scale that has 1 sharp in it, which is G major and E minor. I'm going to go cross those guys off. So let's keep going down this path and see how far we can get before we start running into trouble. So next I'm going to look at D major. So D major is D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp. And likewise, B minor would be the relative minor of that scale. And this is a scale that has 2 sharps. So we can put that one down in our classification as 2 sharps is D / B minor and cross that off. The next one we could look at is A major. So A major looks like A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G sharp. So that's a scale with 3 sharps. And then F sharp is the 6, so F sharp minor would be the relative minor. So we could say scales with 3 sharps are A / F sharp minor. And I promise this will be worthwhile, so just bear with me as we continue going. So A and F sharp minor are gone. The next scale we're going to look at is E major. So E major is E, F sharp, G sharp, A, B, C sharp, D sharp. And that's a scale with 4 sharps in it. And then the relative minor would be C sharp minor. So 4 sharps is E / C sharp minor. And finally, at least for now, the scale with 5 sharps would be B major. So if we looked at B major, it would go B, C sharp, D sharp, E, F sharp, G sharp, and then A sharp. And then the relative minor would be G sharp minor. So we could say a scale with 5 sharps is B/G sharp minor. Well, this has been a pretty good way to start looking at classifying these scales, but we're running into an issue right now, which is that there's only 5 sharps in the chromatic scale, and it seems like with B major and G sharp minor, we've used them all. We're using all 5 sharps in this situation, so how can we continue making this taxonomy? Well, let me take a look at the next scale I want to look at, which is F sharp major. So F sharp major is going to look like F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, B, C sharp, D sharp, and then F. And this is a scale, it looks like it only has 5 sharps, so this kind of classification system might be breaking down. Well, I don't know if you had noticed beforehand, but basically before this F sharp major, every single scale that we had looked at used every letter name exactly one time. So this has a B, a C sharp but no C, a D sharp but no D, an E, an F sharp but no F, G sharp but no F. In fact, this F sharp major scale is the first scale we looked at that has the same letter name, only one sharp and one normal. And if we write a constraint, so if we create this constraint that we only want to write our scales such that each letter is only represented once, each letter name only listed once. Well, if we make this constraint for ourselves, every scale that we have looked at so far would have already passed, but this F sharp major scale wouldn't. So what could we do to this F sharp major scale to make it so that each letter name is only listed once? Well, I had said beforehand in a previous video that there's no such thing as E sharp. Well, that's actually a lie. You can write E sharp. It's just that E sharp is the exact same thing as F. These things are equal to each other. So everyone just writes F instead of E sharp. But this sharp is just referring to the note above E. So one note above E, which is F. Well, if we want to preserve this rule that each letter name is only listed once when we write out a scale, instead of writing F, we actually could call this, I should switch back to green, we should call this E sharp. And if that's the case, that we call F sharp major, the 7 on F sharp major, E sharp, well, now this is a scale with 6 sharps. So it looks like we can continue making our taxonomy and say, well, if you just have this rule that each letter name is only listed once, well, then we have a 6 sharp scale of F sharp major and then D sharp minor as the relative minor. So let's cross those guys off. And that gives us another place to go for the next scale, because we can do the same thing with B and C, the other notes that don't have sharps. And it turns out that C sharp major is C sharp, D sharp, E sharp, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, and then it's C as the last note. But remember, we're going to only write every letter name once, so we can do the same thing with B and do B sharp. And now we've constructed a scale that has 7 sharps in it. So we could say a 7 sharp scale would be C sharp and then A sharp minor as the relative minor. But now it looks like we're really in trouble because there's only 7 notes in a scale. So even though we did this little trick to continue our taxonomy, now we've kind of run up against a wall because there's no way you can have more than 7 sharps. Well, it turns out that that's true, but let's take a look at the next scale and see if there's something interesting we notice. The next scale I want to look at is F major. F major goes F, G, A sharp, C, D, and E. Well, okay, so we have A and A sharp, so immediately we're violating our rule of each letter name only being listed once. But there's nothing we can do to sharpen one of these notes in order to get around this workaround, because this is already sharp, and we don't have a B represented on our scale. Well, if we remember back to the very first video, I said that A sharp is going to be the note that is one step up from A. But there's another way we could represent this concept of this specific note, which is something that is one step down from B. So it's referring to the same idea that either we're going one step up from the A or we're going one step down from the B, but this is still just referring to one frequency. So it turns out that there's this syntax called B flat that is referring to the exact same note as A sharp. This is the exact same frequency. Like if you were playing a piano, you hit the same key to make an A sharp and a B flat. But if we call it B flat instead of A sharp, then we can stick to our rule that we're classifying these scales with each letter name only being represented once. So if instead of calling this A sharp, I called this B flat, well, now what's interesting is I can start to build up a list of scales counting the number of flats they have in the taxonomy. So instead of making 8 sharps, we'll just say this is 1 flat, and this is F major and the relative minor of D minor. And that gives us a way to continue on with our classification, because I can get rid of this F and I can get rid of this D. And now I can say, okay, well, let's look at the next scale that would have 2 flats. And it turns out that this is A sharp major, so over here. So if we did A sharp major, it would look A sharp, C, D, D sharp, F, G, and A at the backside. So A sharp major is interesting because the same thing that we did in the last scale would be to turn this A sharp into a B flat. But we haven't actually done this before where we've transformed the 1 of the scale. Because the way that we're calling these scales is we're referring to them by the same name as the note that's in the root. So if we're changing the style that we're writing the 1 in, it might be helpful to call this, instead of A sharp major, we could also refer to this as B flat major. And that would be the same thing. So that's one interesting thing. And then obviously this D sharp here we could refer to as E flat. And then we have B flat, C, D, E flat, F, G, A. We represent each letter name once. And we have in our taxonomy a way to classify this, only we're going to call it B flat because that's what we're referring to the 1 in. And then the relative minor would be G minor. So we can continue with the taxonomy by doing this kind of manipulation. And we get rid of A sharp major, and we get rid of G minor. So we only have 3 scales left to do. And actually, I did E major already. I just forgot to flip it out. And the relative minor was C sharp minor. So we only have 2 scales left to go. So let's look at a scale that has 3 flats in it. And it's going to turn out that this is going to be E flat major. So that would be the same as D sharp major, only it's going to look like E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat, C, D. It's going to look like that. And then the relative minor will be C minor. So we can say E flat / C minor for 3 flats. And then finally, we have one more scale to classify, and that would be the G sharp major. But again, you can maybe already tell that we're going to call that A flat major instead, just for the terms of this, classification. So we do A flat, B flat, C, D flat, E flat, F, G. And then F minor would be the 6th, so that would be the relative minor. So a scale with 4 flats would be A flat / F minor. And then we have done it. We have used all 12 major scales, and we have used all 12 minor scales, and we have put them into a classification system where each scale has a unique value, and we can actually talk about this in a quantified sense where we could look and say, is there something similar maybe about A major and D major because they're right next to each other in this classification? And that's going to be a very interesting question. So there's a common way in music to organize that classification taxonomy that we just created. And it's called the circle of fifths. Circle of fifths, and that's what you see displayed next to me right now. And you can think of it as you have a scale, for example, C major, and that has 0 sharps in it. And then when you go right on the circle, you're increasing the number of sharps in the scale. So G major had 1 sharp, D major had 2 sharps, etc. And when you go left on the circle, you're increasing the number of flats in the scale. So that F major had 1 flat, B flat major had 2 flats, etc. until you get kind of this middle point where you could think of it in terms of sharps or flats, and it would make sense because this is a circle. You could organize this as F sharp or G flat depending on how you wanted to classify some of the notes. Well, you might be wondering, when I was constructing this in the first place, how I knew what the next note would be. So, for example, if I had C major, and we said that that was C, D, E, F, G, A, B, how did I know that the next thing would be G major? G major. Well, it turns out that G, in terms of C, is going to be the 5, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And we do G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, which is G major. And the next note was D major, or the next scale. And it turns out D is the 5 of the G also. So this distance, right? So the distance from C to G, this is called in music an interval. An interval is the distance between 2 notes in a scale. And the distance between the 1 and the 5 is a fifth. Like, you can call this a fifth, and that's an interval from 1 to 5. Likewise, an interval from 1 to 4, so from C to F, this would be a fourth interval. And in the circle of fifths, in this arrangement, whenever you go right, you are going up a fifth. So you're going up a fifth interval. So to G, G to D, and then if we mapped out D, A would be the fifth of D, etc. But when you're going left, you're going down a fourth. So you're going down a fourth interval. That's why F is here. And then B flat would be the 4 of F major. And that's going to be an important relationship. The relationship between fifth intervals and fourth intervals in music is going to be extremely important also. But this is our first kind of glimpse into it. And we are going to talk a lot about the circle of fifths throughout this series. But for now, the takeaway that you should have that's going to be really interesting to know is that if you're playing a chord in any of these keys, so let's say we play something in D major. Well, the important thing to know is going to be everything that's adjacent to it on the circle is going to sound good when played with it. And that's a big aha revelation for playing music. That if I'm playing D major, I can then play a G major, an A major, a B minor, and an E minor, and switch between them, and it's going to sound really good. But if I played a D major and then I threw, let's say, an A flat major and then a D minor, that's going to sound really weird and contrasting. So the idea that you can classify all the different scales and then have a really quick reference for, all right, I'm going to take this subsection and just chord progression in between them, and it's going to sound pretty good, is a really good hack for amateur musicians. And we're going to look at more on why this is and what I mean when I'm talking about chords and the different kinds of chords in the next video.